The morning air was always a bit crisper in this part of town. It carried the scent of freshly cut grass and expensive perfume, a world away from the smell of diesel fumes and street food that hung in the air around her own small apartment. She pulled the straps of her heavy cleaning bag higher up on her shoulder, the worn canvas digging into her skin. It was a familiar weight, a constant companion on the long walk from the bus stop. Each step on the pristine, perfectly laid sidewalk was a step into a different life. The houses here weren't just houses. They were grand statements with towering columns and immaculate gardens that looked like they belonged on a magazine cover. She walked past them every day, a ghost in someone else's dream. Her worn-out sneakers a silent testament to the miles between their worlds. She finally reached the tall, wrought-iron gates of her destination. They were always open as if the house had no need for barriers, yet she knew it was the most fortified place of all, protected by walls of grief and silence. The long, curved driveway was a smooth, dark river of asphalt, and her footsteps seemed to echo, too loud in the stillness. At the front door she paused, taking a deep breath before inserting the heavy, old-fashioned key. It turned with a deep, satisfying click, a sound that always felt like she was unlocking more than just a door. She was stepping into a place where time had stopped. The moment she stepped inside, the air changed. It was cool and still, carrying the faint, sterile scent of lemon polish and something else, something sad and dusty, like the pages of an old book that hadn't been opened in years. Her own breathing sounded loud in the immense silence. The house was always perfectly clean, a testament to her daily work, but it felt lifeless. It was a beautiful, meticulously kept museum, not a home. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating millions of dust motes that danced like tiny, restless spirits in the golden light. Everything in its place and nothing out of place. No discarded shoes by the door, no half-empty coffee mug on a table, no signs of life at all. She began her routine, a well-practiced dance of efficiency. She moved from room to room, her movements quiet and respectful. In the living room, she wiped down surfaces that were already spotless, her cloth barely picking up any dust. She polished the silver-framed photos on the mantelpiece, her eyes lingering for a moment on the smiling faces captured in them. A happy couple on a beach, a group of friends at a party, a family gathered around a Christmas tree. They were all ghosts from another era, frozen in a time of laughter and light. The man who lived here now, the old man, never looked at them. He moved through the house like a shadow, his presence a heavy, unspoken sadness that settled in every corner. Her eyes were always drawn to the centerpiece of the room, the grand piano. It was a magnificent thing, sleek and black, its polished surface reflecting the room like a dark, still lake. It sat in the corner, majestic and silent, like a sleeping beast. It was the most expensive and most useless object in the entire house. She had been working here for over a year, ever since his wife had passed, and she had never heard a single note played. It was a monument to a silence that had grown so loud it was deafening. She would dust it carefully, her hand hovering over the keys, a strange mix of fear and curiosity in her heart. She wondered what songs it used to sing. She imagined the woman, her face full of life as it was in the photographs, her fingers dancing across the ivory keys, filling these rooms with music and laughter. Now, the keys were pristine, untouched, like a row of unopened letters. Sometimes, when the house was particularly still, she would let her fingers rest lightly on the cool wood of the piano lid. She would close her eyes and try to imagine the sound. A soft melody, perhaps, something that would make you want to sway. She didn't know much about classical music, but she knew what it felt like to have a song stuck in your head, to have a melody lift your spirits on a bad day. Her own children, her two little ones, loved music. They would hum and sing to themselves, making up songs about their day, their voices a bright, chaotic symphony that was the complete opposite of this house. The thought of them brought a small, tired smile to her face. They were her music, her reason for everything. As she was carefully wiping the smooth, curved side of the piano, she heard a floorboard creak from upstairs. Her body tensed, as it always did. It was the sound of the old man stirring from his study, his cave. She heard the slow, shuffling sound of his slippers on the wooden floor, and then the soft thud of his footsteps on the grand staircase. She quickly turned her attention back to her work, focusing intently on a non-existent smudge on the piano's surface, pretending not to have heard him. She had learned that it was easier for both of them if she became invisible. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs, a frail figure in a worn velvet robe. His shoulders were slumped, as if carrying an invisible weight that was crushing him. His hair was thin and white, and his face was a landscape of deep lines and shadows. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the floor, as if he was navigating a path only he could see. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. He walked past her, a faint scent of stale coffee and loneliness trailing behind him, and headed straight for the kitchen. She heard the sound of the faucet running, then the clink of a glass. A few moments later, he walked back, his steps just as slow and heavy, his glass of water held loosely in his hand. He was a prisoner in his own beautiful home, and she was just another piece of the furniture, a silent witness to his solitary confinement. When he was gone, back up in his study, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The encounter always left her feeling a little hollow. It wasn't just pity she felt for him. It was a deeper, more profound sense of empathy. She knew about loneliness too. Not in the same way, perhaps. Her life was full of the noise and chaos of her children, but there were moments, late at night after they were asleep, when the silence of her own small apartment would feel just as heavy as this one. A different kind of loneliness, but a loneliness just the same. She finished her work, her mind already drifting towards home. She thought about what she would make for dinner, a simple meal of rice and beans that would stretch for another day. She thought about the permission slip she needed to sign for her daughter's school trip, and the fact that her son's shoes were getting tight again. These were the small, real worries that grounded her, that pulled her back from the edge of this silent, sad world. As she packed up her cleaning supplies, her bag felt a little lighter than it had that morning. She was leaving the silence behind. She was going back to the music. She walked out the front door, closing it gently behind her, the click of the lock sounding like the end of a long, quiet song. As she walked down the driveway, she glanced back at the house, a giant, beautiful tomb, and felt a strange, unfamiliar pull. A feeling that she couldn't quite name, a small seed of an idea that had been planted in the quiet, still air. The walk home felt different that day. The crisp air of the wealthy neighborhood didn't just carry the scent of cut grass anymore. It carried the weight of a secret. The image of the photograph was stuck in her mind, a bright, colorful ghost floating against the gray backdrop of her thoughts. She saw the happy couple everywhere she looked, in the faces of strangers on the bus, in the reflection in the shop windows. It was a story that had been locked away in that silent house, and she had accidentally been given the key. She clutched her cleaning bag to her side, but it felt lighter, as if the discovery had lifted some of the burden from her shoulders. The city rushed by outside the bus window, a blur of noise and motion, but she was in her own world. A world filled with the memory of a smiling woman and a piece of music called Claire de Lune. When she finally got back to her own small apartment, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The silence she had left behind was replaced by a symphony of life. The television was on, cartoons characters were talking in high-pitched voices, and from the small kitchen, she could hear the familiar sound of her two children arguing playfully over who got the last cookie. It was a sound that usually made her tired after a long day, but today it was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. It was the sound of her world, a world that was messy and loud and full of love. She dropped her bag by the door and took a deep breath, letting the warmth of her home wrap around her like a blanket. Her twins came running to greet her, a whirlwind of tangled limbs and excited chatter. They hugged her legs, talking over each other about their day at school, a fight over a crayon, a game they had invented in the playground. She knelt down and hugged them back, burying her face in their hair, breathing in the scent of shampoo and dirt and little kid sweat. This was her reality, her anchor. In the grand, empty house she cleaned, she was a ghost, but here she was the center of the universe. She was their mother. After dinner, When the small apartment was quiet and the twins were supposed to be getting ready for bed, she remembered the piece of paper she had carefully folded and tucked into her pocket. It felt like a fragile, living thing. She pulled it out, the yellowed paper looking strangely out of place on her cluttered kitchen table. Next to a half-finished glass of milk and a drawing of a purple cat, the twins, who were supposed to be brushing their teeth, were drawn by her curiosity. They crept back into the kitchen, their eyes wide with interest. "What's that, Mom?" the girl asked, her voice a soft whisper. "Just something I found today," she said, her fingers gently tracing the elegant flowing title. "It's music." The boy leaned closer, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was the more serious of the two, the thinker. "Can you play it?" She shook her head. "No, I can't. I don't know how." She looked at the strange notes on the page, a language she couldn't read. "It's called Clair de Lune. It sounds pretty, doesn't it?" The girl's eyes lit up, a spark of recognition in them. "I know that song," she exclaimed, a little too loudly. She clapped her hand over her own mouth, then whispered again, "We know that song." The woman stared at her, her heart giving a little skip. "You do? How?" She had bought them a small, cheap keyboard a few months ago from a thrift store, a dusty old thing with a couple of sticky keys. She thought it would be a good toy, something to keep them busy, a way for them to make noise that wasn't just shouting. She had no idea they were actually learning to play. The twins looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. It was their secret, a world they had built together that she knew nothing about. The boy took her hand. "Come on," he said, pulling her towards their small bedroom. "We'll show you." Their room was even smaller than the rest of the apartment, a cozy space filled with bunk beds, stuffed animals, and books. Tucked away in the corner, almost hidden under a pile of clothes, was the keyboard. It was a flimsy plastic thing, a world away from the grand piano in the mansion, but as they cleared the clothes off it, it seemed to take on a new importance. The twins sat side by side on a small stool, their small bodies fitting perfectly together. "We found it on the computer," the girl explained, her fingers hovering over the keys. "There are videos that teach you how to play. For free. We've been practicing after you go to sleep," the boy added, a little sheepishly. "We try to be quiet." She sank down onto the edge of their bottom bunk, her heart full of a confusing mix of emotions. Pride, surprise, and a little bit of sadness that she hadn't known about this hidden talent of theirs. She watched as they placed their small fingers on the keys. They looked at each other one last time, a silent countdown, and then they began to play. The melody that came out was simple, a little halting in places, and one of the keys was definitely out of tune. But it was unmistakably Clair de Lune. The notes hung in the air of the small room, filling the space with a beauty that seemed impossible coming from such a humble instrument. She closed her eyes, and she wasn't in her small apartment anymore. She was back in the silent house, standing in front of the grand piano, imagining the woman from the photograph playing this exact song. But now the music was real. It was being played by her children, her own beautiful, talented children. As they played the last few notes, a single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, not wanting them to see. They finished the song and turned to her, their faces bright with pride, looking for her approval. "It was beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." And in that moment, the idea began to form. It was just a tiny spark at first, a crazy, impossible thought. But as she looked at her children, at their hopeful faces and their talented hands, the spark grew into a flame. She thought of the old man, lost in his world of silence. She thought of the beautiful, silent piano. And she thought of this beautiful, secret music her children had been hiding. What if? What if these two worlds could meet? What if her children, with their small, second-hand keyboard and their big, open hearts, could bring the music back to that house? What if they could play that song for him? It was a wild idea, a risk, a step far outside the boundaries of her job. But as she looked at the sheet music lying on her kitchen table, it didn't feel like just a piece of paper anymore. It felt like an invitation to do something beautiful. The idea was a small seed planted in the quiet of her small apartment, but overnight it grew into something much bigger. She barely slept, the melody of Clair de Lune playing in her head, not as it sounded on the twins' cheap keyboard, but as it could sound on the grand piano. She pictured the old man's face, the deep lines of sadness etched around his eyes. She thought about the photograph, the woman smiling, the piano, a silent witness to a life that was no longer there. It felt like a crazy, impossible idea, a line she shouldn't cross. She was the maid, hired to clean and be invisible. But she was also a mother, and she knew what it felt like to have a hole in your heart that only music and love could fill. The next morning, as the sun streamed through the kitchen window, she knew she had to try. She waited until after dinner. When the plates were cleared and the twins were sitting at the table, drawing in their notebooks, she took a deep breath, her heart beating a little faster than usual. "I have something important to ask you," she began, her voice soft. They looked up at her, their crayons pausing mid-stroke. She told them about the old man again, not as a client, but as a person. She described the big, quiet house where no one laughed anymore. She told them about the beautiful piano that hadn't made a sound in a very long time, and how the song they knew, Clair de Lune, was his wife's favorite. "Remember how you felt when you played for me last night?" she asked them. "How it made my heart feel full?" They both nodded, their eyes wide. "I was thinking," she continued, choosing her words carefully, "what if we could share that feeling with him? What if we could play that song for him on his big piano?" The twins looked at each other. A silent conversation passed between them, a language of raised eyebrows and slight smiles that only they understood. It was the boy who spoke first, his voice serious. "But we're not allowed to touch his things." "I know," she said. "And that's why it would be our secret. A special mission. We wouldn't be just touching his piano. We would be giving him a gift. The gift of music." The girl's eyes lit up. "A secret mission," she whispered, the idea thrilling her. The boy, ever the cautious one, still looked unsure. "What if he gets mad?" he asked. "He won't," she said, with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Because sometimes when people are very sad, a kind surprise is the only thing that can help. And you two are the kindest surprise I know." The promise of a secret mission was too exciting to resist. They both agreed, their nervousness now mixed with a sense of adventure. That night, their small apartment transformed into a secret conservatory. After their homework was done and the city outside began to quiet down, she would pull out the keyboard from its corner. The first few nights were difficult. The twins were excited, but their small fingers would get tired. They would argue over who was playing the wrong note. The cheap keyboard, with its sticky keys and tinny sound, was a frustrating instrument. The melody was there, but it was clumsy. Lacking the grace and feeling it needed, she became their coach, their conductor, their biggest fan. She didn't know anything about music, about timing or technique, but she knew about feelings. "Don't just play the notes," she would tell them, kneeling beside them as they sat on their small stool. "Think about the story. It's a sad story, but a beautiful one, like looking at the moon. It's lonely, but it's also peaceful. Try to play it like you're telling that story with your fingers." She would remind them of the photograph of the smiling woman and the silent man. "You're playing for her," she would whisper, "and you're playing for him. You're reminding him of the happy times." This seemed to work. The twins began to focus less on hitting the right notes and more on the sound they were creating together. Their movements became more fluid, more in sync. They started to listen to each other, to breathe together, their small bodies swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. The late-night practices became their special time. The world outside their window would fade away, and it was just the three of them, wrapped in the soft glow of a single lamp, creating something beautiful out of silence. She would make them hot chocolate, and they would talk about their plan. They decided the boy would start, his steady hands perfect for the soft opening notes, and the girl would join in, her lighter touch adding the delicate layers to the melody. They practiced how to walk quietly, how to sit on the big piano bench without making a sound, how to bow when they were finished. Just like they had seen musicians do in videos. There were moments of doubt. One night, the twins were tired and cranky. They made mistake after mistake, and the boy finally slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration. "We can't do it," he shouted, his voice thick with tears. "It's too hard." For a moment, she felt a wave of guilt. Was she pushing them too hard? Was this unfair, putting the weight of a grieving man's happiness on their small shoulders? She almost called it off, but then the girl, who was usually the more emotional one, put her arm around her brother. "It's okay," she said softly. "Remember the sad man. We have to help him." Her simple words cut through the frustration. The boy took a deep breath, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and nodded. They put their fingers back on the keys and started again, their music a little more determined, a little more heartfelt than before. As the days turned into a couple of weeks, the song began to take shape. It was no longer just a series of notes. It was a story. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had quiet moments and loud moments, sad parts and hopeful parts. She would listen, her heart swelling with a pride so powerful it almost hurt. These were her children, her two little miracles, who had learned to create magic on a thrift store keyboard in the corner of a small apartment. She also figured out the practical part of their mission. She would tell the old man that her regular childcare had fallen through at the last minute, and she had no choice but to bring them with her. It was a plausible excuse, one that he would likely accept without much thought. She rehearsed the story in her head, making it sound casual and unimportant. The less attention they drew to themselves beforehand, the better. The night before the planned day, the apartment was buzzing with a nervous energy. They did one final run-through of the song. It was the best they had ever played it. The notes hung in the air, clear and full of emotion. When they finished, the room was silent for a moment. The twins looked at her, their faces a mixture of fear and excitement. She gave them a thumbs up, her own hands trembling slightly. The secret symphony was ready. The stage was set. All they had to do now was walk into the silent house and play. The morning of the planned day felt different. The usual rush of getting ready for school and work was replaced with a quiet, nervous energy. The twins were up before her, already dressed in their best clothes, not because she had told them to, but because they understood this was not a normal day. They sat at the kitchen table, pushing their cereal around their bowls, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. The apartment, usually filled with their chaotic noise, was strangely still. She could feel their anticipation in the air, a tangible thing that made her own heart beat a little faster. She made them their favorite breakfast, trying to act normal, but her hands were trembling slightly as she poured the milk. On the bus ride, the city blurred past the window, but she didn't see it. Her mind was a storm of what-ifs. What if he said no? What if he got angry? What if the twins froze and couldn't play a single note? She looked down at them, sitting on either side of her, their small hands clutching their backpacks. They were putting so much trust in her, trusting her crazy, wonderful idea. She took a deep breath and pushed the doubts away. She had to believe in them and in the power of the music they had created together in the small corner of their apartment. When they arrived at the tall, wrought-iron gates, the twins fell silent. They had never been here with her before. The grand house looked even bigger and more intimidating through their eyes. She squeezed their hands. "Remember our secret mission," she whispered. "Just be quiet and follow my lead." They nodded, their faces serious. As she unlocked the front door, the familiar cool, still air washed over them. But today it felt heavier, thick with unspoken possibilities. The old man was in the hallway, on his way to his study, a rare occurrence in the morning. He stopped when he saw them, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. He looked from her to the two small children standing nervously behind her, their eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment no one spoke. The silence was so loud it hurt her ears. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice sounding much smaller than she intended. "My usual childcare fell through at the last minute. I had no other choice. I promise they will be very quiet. They'll just sit in a corner and not touch anything." She had rehearsed the speech, but now the words felt clumsy and false. The old man looked at the twins for a long time. His gaze wasn't unkind, just distant, as if he was looking at them through a thick fog. He seemed to be processing the information, the disruption to his carefully controlled, silent world. She held her breath, waiting for him to refuse, to tell her to go home. But then he just gave a slow, tired nod. "It's fine," he mumbled, his voice raspy from disuse. "Just keep them out of my way." And with that he turned and shuffled back into his study, closing the door behind him, leaving them alone in the vast, quiet hallway. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. They were in. The first part of their mission was a success. She led the twins into the living room, their sneakers making soft, squeaking sounds on the polished wooden floor. They looked around the room with wide-eyed wonder, their previous nervousness forgotten for a moment. It was like stepping into another world. The girl pointed at the high, arched ceilings, and the boy stared at the grand piano, his eyes full of awe. It was even bigger than he had imagined. She tried to start her cleaning, moving around the room with a feather duster, but her heart wasn't in it. Her hands were sweaty, and her mind was racing. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. She told the twins to sit on a small sofa against the far wall, out of the way. They sat side by side, holding hands, their small bodies straight and still. They looked like two little birds waiting for a signal. She would catch their eye and give them a small, reassuring smile, but she could see the fear and excitement dancing in their eyes. The time seemed to crawl by. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with a loud, rhythmic beat that seemed to count down the moments. She wiped the same spot on the table 3 times, her mind a million miles away. She thought about the long nights of practice, the frustration, the tears, and the moments of pure joy. It all came down to this. She looked at the old man's closed study door. What was he doing in there? Was he reading? Was he just sitting in the dark? She had a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. Who were they to burst into his life like this? Who were they to disturb his grief with their secret mission? But then she looked at her children, their brave little faces full of hope, and she knew she was doing the right thing. Finally, the long hand of the clock pointed to the 3. The moment had arrived. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure they could all hear it. She stopped her cleaning and stood in the middle of the room, facing the twins. She looked at them, her eyes full of all the love and pride she felt. She gave them a slow, deliberate nod. It was the signal. The twins took a deep breath together. They slid off the sofa and stood up, their hands still clasped. They began to walk across the vast expanse of the living room, their small footsteps barely making a sound on the thick rug. It was the longest walk of their lives. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated their path, making their hair shine like halos. They looked like 2 small angels on a sacred journey. They reached the piano. It towered over them, a sleek, black giant. For a moment, they just stood there, looking up at it. Then, the boy let go of his sister's hand and climbed onto the polished bench, his legs dangling high above the floor. The girl followed, sitting close beside him. They looked at each other one last time, a world of communication passing between them in a single glance. "Don't be scared. I'm here with you. We can do this." The boy placed his small fingers on the ivory keys. They looked so tiny against the long, smooth rows of white and black. He closed his eyes for a second, took another deep breath, and then he pressed down. The first note of Clair de Lune broke the heavy silence of the house. It wasn't loud. It was soft, delicate, but it carried. It was like a single drop of water falling into a still, deep pool, sending ripples out into the quiet air. The sound was so pure, so full of emotion, that it seemed to stop time itself. The woman froze, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes instantly. In the study, the old man was sitting in his worn leather chair, staring at a closed book on his lap. The sound drifted through the heavy wooden door, faint at first, then clearer. He frowned, confused. What was that, music? In his house? He hadn't heard music in here for over a year. He thought he was imagining it, a memory playing tricks on his tired mind. But then another note followed, and another, weaving together into a familiar, heartbreaking melody. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that song. It was her song. The one she used to play on sunny afternoons, the one that filled this house with warmth and light. He slowly stood up, his body feeling stiff and heavy. He walked to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob outside. The twins were lost in their music. The boy's fingers danced across the keys, playing the simple, haunting melody with a skill that seemed impossible for his age. The girl joined in, her part a delicate, harmonious echo that added depth and beauty to the song. They weren't just playing notes anymore. They were telling a story. A story of love and loss, of sadness and beauty, of moonlight and memories. They swayed slightly on the bench, their bodies moving as one with the music. The woman watched them, her vision blurred by tears, her heart overflowing with a love so powerful it almost hurt. They were creating something magical, something pure and good, right here in the middle of all this silence and sadness. They were giving the old man the most beautiful gift she could ever imagine. The last note of Clair de Lune hung in the air for a moment, a fragile, shimmering thing, before it was swallowed by the silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't the heavy, empty silence that had lived in this house for so long. This new silence was full. It was full of echoes and memories, full of the unspoken story the twins had just told with their small, talented hands. The boy and girl sat on the vast piano bench, their backs straight, their fingers frozen over the keys. They didn't move. They didn't dare. They just stared at the polished wood in front of them, their hearts thumping against their ribs like trapped birds. The woman stood frozen in the middle of the room, her hand still covering her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. She had expected it to be beautiful, but she hadn't expected it to feel so holy, so much like a prayer. Then they heard it. A soft click from across the room. The door to the study was opening. It swung inward slowly, revealing the dark, book-lined cave where the old man had hidden himself away from the world. He stood in the doorway, a frail silhouette against the darkness. He didn't move. He just stood there, his body perfectly still, as if the slightest movement might shatter the fragile magic that still lingered in the air. The twins saw him, and their small bodies tensed. Their mission was over. Now they would face the consequence. He took a step out of the study, and then another. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed not on the maid, but on the two small children sitting at his wife's piano. As he got closer, the woman could see his face more clearly in the bright sunlight. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide with disbelief. And then she saw something she had never seen before. Tears, they welled up in his eyes, spilling over and tracing paths through the deep lines on his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He just let them fall. He stopped a few feet from the piano, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet sniffling of the old man and the pounding of their own hearts. He looked at the twins, his gaze soft and full of a pain so deep it was almost beautiful. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked sound came out. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice a hoarse, fragile whisper. "How?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on the children. "How did you know that song?" The twins looked at their mother, their faces full of fear and confusion. She took a step forward, her own tears now falling freely. "I found the sheet music," she said softly, her voice trembling, "tucked behind a photograph. I didn't know. I just thought it was a pretty song." The old man's gaze shifted to her for a brief second, a flicker of understanding in his eyes before returning to the twins. He slowly, carefully lowered himself to his knees, a difficult, painful movement that brought him down to their level. He was no longer a towering figure of wealth and sorrow. He was just a man, broken and humbled, before two children. "That was her favorite song," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the last thing she ever played for me. In this very spot." He reached out a trembling hand. Not to touch them, but just to hover over the keys, as if he could feel the ghost of the music they had just created. The girl, the braver of the two, found her voice. "We wanted to give you a surprise," she said, her voice small but clear. "A beautiful surprise." The old man let out a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh. He looked at the boy, then at the girl, a look of profound gratitude on his face. "It is," he whispered. "It is the most beautiful surprise I have ever received." He looked at the woman, his eyes filled with a new light, a spark of life that had been extinguished for so long. "You did this," he said to her. "You brought this back into my house." She shook her head, her heart swelling with a pride and love so intense it was almost painful. "No," she said softly. "They did. They have a gift. And they just wanted to share it." He pushed himself slowly to his feet, his expression changing from one of overwhelming grief to one of firm resolve. "A gift like this," he said, his voice stronger now, "it cannot be ignored. It cannot be wasted on a second-hand keyboard." He looked at the twins, a determined look in his eyes. "You will have proper lessons, with the best teacher in the city. I will arrange it. It is not a request. It is the very least I can do." The woman started to protest. "Oh, no, we couldn't possibly. That's too much. This wasn't about—" He held up a hand, silencing her gently. "Please," he said, "let me do this. You have given me something that no amount of money could ever buy. You have given me back a memory. You have filled this house with music again. Let me nurture this gift that you have shared with me. It would be my honor." He framed it not as a payment, but as an investment, a way to keep the music alive, a way to honor his wife's memory by helping two children create the beauty she had so loved. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The heavy cloak of sadness had lifted, replaced by a warm, gentle light of connection. The old man was no longer a distant, sorrowful figure. He was talking, asking the twins about their keyboard, about how they learned, his eyes shining with a genuine interest that had been absent for over a year. He even smiled, a real, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look 10 years younger. He offered them all a glass of lemonade, a simple, everyday gesture that felt like the most monumental act of kindness in the world. As they sat in his kitchen, a room that had likely seen as little use as the piano, the woman watched her children chatter away with the old man. She saw the way he listened to them, really listened, his head tilted, his full attention on their small stories. She realized that her secret mission had accomplished more than she had ever dared to hope. It wasn't just about playing a song. It was about building a bridge between two very different worlds, connected by a simple, beautiful melody. In the weeks that followed, the house was forever changed. The grand piano was no longer a silent monument to grief. It became the heart of the home. Twice a week, a stern but kind piano teacher would arrive, and the twins would rush to the bench, their faces alight with excitement. The woman would continue her cleaning, but now she worked to the sound of scales and sonatas, to the occasional frustrated sigh and the triumphant flourish of a mastered piece. The old man would often sit in his favorite armchair, a book in his lap that he was actually reading, listening with a faint, peaceful smile on his face. The music was no longer a painful echo of the past. It was the vibrant, joyful sound of the present. It was the sound of healing, the sound of friendship, and the sound of a new, unexpected family being born, one beautiful note at a time. The silent piano now sang, and in its song a broken heart found a new rhythm.